Hi, I'm Don Womble, and I'm glad to have you join with me on this study of the Book of Esther in the Old Testament. Esther is one of the best, most exciting books to me in the Bible. It's a very short one, but I think you'll find out why as I kind of go through some things here with you. So I'm going to take this as though you really don't know anything about the Book of Esther, and you may know more about the book than I do. So we're going to be giving you a little bit of background about the Book of Esther. I believe the verses that I used in this are mostly NIV if you want to follow along that way. And so feel free, you can pause this, if you'd like, go ahead and get a pen and paper or something if you don't have one with you, because we're going to look at verse by verse, and I'm going to give you comments on each one. So just to begin with here, let's talk about the time frame of Esther. It's somewhere after 473 BC. That's sometime after the events in the Book of Esther took place. That's a long time ago. The author of the Book of Esther, we know that it's in God's Word, so Holy Spirit's the author, but actually the person who wrote it, we don't know who it was. It might have been Mordecai, which is a key person we'll find in the story. And we don't think it was Esther. Back during that day of time, it was such a male-controlled society. Women, it would have been uncommon for them to be the writer of any type of a book. The underlying theme, and that's what I've entitled this study, is God's timing is perfect. It's the sovereignty of God, how God is in control, and we're certainly not. I think we understand that. So the unusual aspect, one major unusual aspect of the Book of Esther is that there's no mention of God in the entire Book of Esther. No mention of God at all. It's about the Jewish people, and they're in captivity under the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire is basically the strongest empire in the world at that time, other than the Grecian Empire, which you'll be seeing some things about that. Archaeology, there's still some archaeology concerning the Book of Esther. There's a lot of archaeology, as a matter of fact. The book itself, one cool thing I think is really awesome as far as details, and that's it's very precise with the customs of the time, the Persian customs of the time. It correlates with history, secular history of Persia during the same time that the events took place in the Book of Esther. And here's something else. The Feast of Purim, P-U-R-I-M. This is a feast that even today, those who are dedicated Jewish believers in Judaism, devout Jews, they will even have the worship of Purim, or the worship of the feast and the celebration of the feast. It's a Jewish festival holiday, and the reason that they're having it, it's because of the events of freedom that took place with the Jewish people here under Persian captivity. It's a time of giving, celebration, and sharing. Now here are a couple of strong major spiritual concepts that we find in the Book of Esther. Fasting and prayer. It's very, very heavily fasting and prayer, the contents, and we'll see that. Let me give you real quick here just kind of a little preview of the personalities, the key personalities in the Book of Esther. Well, of course, Esther, she's the young Jewish woman who becomes queen for the king of Persia. Mordecai is kind of like Esther's guardian. Actually, they were cousins, and he apparently kind of adopted her or became like her father figure and raised her. There is a bad man. There's always got to be a bad man in every story. And Haman, or Haman, however we want to say it, he was a descendant of King Agag and a big, big enemy of the Jews. And he causes a lot of problems in the Book of Esther that you're going to see. He had a lot of pride, and that actually led to his defeat. And then Vashti, she was the current queen. When you open up the Book of Esther, here in chapter 1, she was the current queen of the king of Persia. And then Ahasuerus, which we will call him mostly Xerxes. That's what he's known by more than anything. He was the king during this time. Let me just kind of give you something that you can use as imagery to connect with what was going on here during the time that we see the events in the Book of Esther. Maybe or maybe not, you've seen the movie 300. Gerard Butler was Leonidas I. Rodrigo Santoro was Xerxes. You may remember that big battle, and that Xerxes was like this huge, tall guy, slick-headed and in much command. Well, that's the Xerxes we're talking about. Now, looking at the true Xerxes, they said that Xerxes himself was actually 8 feet tall. I think the guy in the movie was like 9 feet tall. He was actually 8 feet tall, but he had long hair and he had a long, long beard. And so, that was pretty common in that day, but his height was uncommon. And here's something else about Xerxes. Different from the movie Xerxes, he never went to the front line of battle at the Battle of Thermopylae. But Xerxes is famous in secular history for 2 main reasons. Number one, his defeat at the hands of the Greeks. His father is mentioned in the book of Daniel, the king Darius. That was actually Xerxes' father, or Xerxes the first. See, he went and he took 200,000 soldiers to battle against the Greeks, actually in revenge for the battle that his dad Darius lost. So he's in history with that. And also he built an amazing, beautiful, magnificent Persian empire with buildings and all the tapestry and all of that. So he's really known for that type of thing. Now, there's some remains of the Persian Empire. If you go to Iran, there's some remains, and it's kind of designated so, and some of you may have been there being military on some type of work or just vacation at one time in your life. Iran and Persia are synonymous for the same thing even today. My wife and I the other day watched a movie called The Prince of Persia, and my mind always went back to the Book of Esther here. But I want to dive in, and we're going to go verse by verse, and I'll explain some things, and we'll come to a point we'll stop. The first 4 verses, we're going to talk about pride being on display, and I'm going to read verse 1. It reads like this. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. Now, these were political subdivisions of Persia. Kush is the same we know today as Ethiopia. And today the provinces of that Persian Empire covered these, and I'll read. India, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, Syria, Arabia, and Ethiopia. So it was a huge, huge, huge empire. Verse 2, at that time King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. Now the royal throne was talking about where he was at this time, which it was the king's winter royal fortress. It stood, we're told, about 72 feet above the city itself. So think of a building that's over 7 stories high. It was a huge, huge palace. And citadel actually means capital. So it was the capital of his empire. Verse 3, and the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. So all the bigwigs were there. The really important people were there. Now notice how long this entire thing lasted. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. So some historians tell us that actually what he was doing here is he was planning his strategic military plans for his campaign against Greece that I told you that he went and lost. 180 days, man, that's a long party. That's a huge banquet. That's 6 months in length. And so he was showing everything off, and the Greek historian Herodotus said that Xerxes spent 4 years on his military campaign. Well, let's talk about his party that he threw. So he was a party-hardy type guy. If you look in verses 5 through 8 with me, let me read. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material, to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. So you can see how extravagant. I mean, there was no money actually that almost wasn't used that I would think of. There'd be extra money to do what they wanted to do, to have beauty and splendor in things that they had. Well, it goes on to talk about wine was served in the gold goblets. It says, this is in verse 7, each one different from the other. Now think about that. Each gold goblet was different than the other, and they were made out of gold, so they were handmade. And the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. Verse 8, by the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions. I mean, there were a lot of drunk people around there, right? It says, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So here they were in all their splendor. It mentioned the colors blue and white. That was the royal colors of Persia. And in that day, the more lavish the king's hospitality proved, the more of his greatness and the more of his wealth and the more of his power as being a world leader. It wasn't uncommon for kings to want to impress others. I mean, just a few hundred years earlier, we read of the king of Judah, Hezekiah. He did a little showing off himself. If some of you are taking notes, let me just give you 2 Kings chapter 20. You can see that. And he showed all of his guests, everything he had, all of his treasures, all of his wealth, all of his harem, everything that he had. So when you look at this, it seems quite extravagant, and it actually was, but that was the tradition of that day and time, for kings to show off the splendor of their kingdom. Ancient traditions tell us that they certainly were extravagant, yes, but at the same time, they were very careful with who they showed things to. We note some sin coming in here, and it produces problems. And so I've kind of titled this next spot right here, The Problem That Sin Produces, and we're going to look at verses 9 through 12. In verse 9, it reads like this. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Okay, so now it was time for her time to shine, the queen. She had to have her own banquet. In verse 10, on the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, that means he was slammed, okay? That's what it means. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him. And let me try to read these. Mehuman, Biztha, Harbana, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zaphar, and Carcass. These were his eunuchs. Now, let me kind of explain to you what this was all about. A king would make men to be their eunuchs. These were the inner court workers, those who were the closest to the most precious things that kings had. And some of the most precious things that kings had was their harem, because they would have hundreds sometimes of women that were in their harem. And the kings made these guys eunuchs to protect and manage their harem. Now, what that basically means is the men were emasculated, or they were castrated, so to speak. So this decreased the likelihood that men would be having sexual relationships with these beauty queens of Persia. I was thinking about that, and I thought, as a father during that time, I would certainly hope that if I had a daughter, that she wouldn't be quite as beautiful, that all of the beauty scouts for the queen, for the king, would be out there looking for her. But that's just my personal opinion. So here we go in verse 11. To bring before him Queen Vashti. So they came and they said, Queen Vashti, the king wants you. And here's what it says. Wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. That means she was hot, okay? But when the attendants, this is verse 12, delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Vashti means the desired one, so she was apparently a very, very beautiful woman. But she refused to go to the king. This was a big no-no in that day. You didn't refuse anything to the king. And so you look at this and it makes you wonder, why was she refusing to go at the king's request and leave her banquet and go and show herself off? Well, many theologians studying this and rabbis looking at it deep and comparing the Hebrew words tell us that what he was wanting her to do was to come and appear before all the nobles of the provinces with very little clothes on, close to naked. Well, you know as well as I know, during this day and time, much less during that day and time, women, they were very, very they were clothed well, self-clothed. They would have robes on. They would have a hooding over their head. Even like today, over in the Middle East, we see the same thing, and a scarf around their face. It was certainly not a royal thing to do for a queen to show her body to other people, and especially to other men who would just be basking their eyes upon her. And so when you look at that, it was not comfortable. Let me just say this. When you're visiting those countries today, it is not uncommon for them to have restrictions in certain areas for tourists, that tourists should dress a certain way because they do not want tourists to come in wearing short shorts or short dresses and dressed in such a way that's going to make the people of their country today even feel uncomfortable with the way that they're dressed. We find that in our story here, Vashti's response did not set well with the drunk King Xerxes. He was furious, he was embarrassed, and he was angry. So what's going to happen next? Well, if you'll look at our next lesson with us, lesson 2, we'll talk about that.